Good morning. I feel like I need to respect the fact that you guys got up early and got here on time. So I'm going to get started as well. My name is Chris Teaf. I'm a toxicologist. Been at Florida State for about 40 years. But I'm afraid of PFAS. It's the most amazing group of chemicals that I've encountered in my practice. So we'll see, there's a lot of different discussions going on here. Environmental, ecological, human health, engineering, analytical, all of those are really important, and it's nice to be able to get this kind of a group together to have those kinds of conversations. I'm going to get right into it. I'm going to introduce the speakers. We're going to try to stay on time. We'll run the trains on time. I won't cut people off, but we really do need to stick within our time frame. If there are a couple of minutes afterwards for questions, I'll be more than happy to try to entertain those with the right speaker. And then please don't hesitate to get in touch with them afterwards if you'd like to do that. So our first speaker is Tanya Chandler. She's the president of BioLargo Equipment Solutions and Technologies Incorporated. She's from Wisconsin?
Yes.
Wisconsin, far from Florida. She's going to speak to you this morning about beyond the chemistry, the commercial and social implications of regulating or eliminating PFAS. Good luck with that last part, by the way.
Yeah. Good morning. So I have an interesting topic to talk about because so far through the conference we've gotten to hear a lot about, as he said, the toxicology of this, how to look at following the plumes and treating this, but nobody really has talked about what does all of this mean. Because I often get asked the question, why don't we just eliminate PFAS? Why can't we just get rid of PFAS completely? So I ask you, as I look at this, and as we've talked, many people have talked about where they're found. So we've talked about the atomic bomb, we've talked about guitar strings, waterproof makeup, dental floss, non-stick pans. These all contain PFAS. And we've seen slides like this where we talk about they're in, our waterproof clothing and everything. But let's talk about the places that they are that are not on this slide and why we will never see them completely go away. Anybody who has had retina surgery on their eye, has had a hip replacement, a knee replacement, a heart valve replacement, y'all have PFAS in your body. They are prevalent in the medical industry more than we know. They're used in making the medications, they're used in manufacturing the medications, and that's not going to go away because the properties that make them horrible are also what make them amazing in these applications. When you get a valve replacement in your body or you get an organ transplant, you don't want it to react with anything. You don't want your body to react. So they use PFAS compounds. When we talk about the military, they're never going away in the military because they're used in every warhead that we have, and they're not going to jeopardize our national security. So to try and just ban PFAS across the board, even though some states have tried, it's not going to happen. So what are we looking at with the implications? Let's take a look at the numbers. The average cost of a pound of PFAS. Now think about that for a minute because we use it in parts per trillion. A pound of PFAS is going to run you, depending on the PFAS, anywhere from $50 to $1,000 a pound. The average cost to remove that same pound of PFAS is going to be for a community is somewhere between 2.7 and 18 million over the cost of its lifespan. The yearly social impact of that, thinking about the medical costs, thinking about the cost to remove it from the environment, the damage that it's done, about $17.5 trillion a year. All of that for an annual profit combined from the top 12 companies about $4 billion a year. Doesn't seem like a good balance, does it? Many states have tried to curb this. Maine took the lead. Maine said, I want to be the first state to ban all intentionally added PFAS. There's a caveat in that. In the little fine print of that rule, what you see is it says, unless there are no viable alternatives. A lot of states are doing the no viable alternatives. Why? Because most technical advancements that we have from the 1939-40 range on can be linked to PFAS. If we wanted to get rid of them, we would have to be willing to give up our cell phones, give up our contact lenses, give up all of the creature comforts that we have because they're in most plastics. And none of us are really willing to fully do that. So they say intentionally added, the ones that we're intentionally adding when there's no alternatives. But your contact lens is about 98, 99% PFAS. And they've made our lives so much easier. But we are taking steps to get them out of our food supply. They're making laws to change the packaging. So not only have states phased out the packaging, there is bills inside of the government and regulations going through the FDA right now to ban it in all food packaging. There's rules for carpets, rugs, the aftermarket treatments like the Scotch Guards. But remember, we get rid of the Scotch Guard on our carpet and now our carpets will stain much easier. So when we drop that glass of red wine on our carpet, instead of pooling at the top, it's going to go into the fibers and stain. Lots of states are going after things like children's products. Somebody put up a slide the other day about fear and all of the fear that surrounds PFAS. Well, we've done a great job of talking about it really quick, where we're telling people that it's in our food supply, it's in our clothing, it's in our kids' stuff, and it's in our pet food. Pretty much that guaranteed that all of our laws were going to go through pretty quickly. Vermont banned it in our ski wax. So have fun, skiers. You're going to go back to the old-fashioned way of waxing your skis. Cosmetics. Anytime you see the label waterproof on eyeliner, mascara, some of our cleaners that we use to take our makeup off, those all contain PFAS, and there's a lot of steps to take those out of the marketplace or have them change the formulations. And of course, we've talked about firefighting foam and firefighting film. That one's going to take a lot longer, I'll be honest with you guys. There is the ban of AFFF, but most states have gone to the idea that you can't practice with AFFF foam, but you can still use it in an emergency. And why is that? And that is, somebody put up the mil-spec for the new firefighting foams the other day, and they talked about the fact that the mil-spec isn't meeting the needs. Part of the reason that that mil-spec isn't meeting the needs is because the new firefighting foams that are out right now do not put out lithium-ion fires. They do not put out jet fuel fires. Because the reason that AFFF was developed in the 60s started with the USS Forrestal fire and a jet fuel fire that cost us 137 sailors. And they came to 3M and DuPont and they said, we need to create something that will work much better. So it was specifically designed to put out these type of fires. Why? Because it smothers the fire, it scavenges the oxygen, and it doesn't allow evaporation. All of the things that are needed when you talk about a fire that is a propellant or something that's going to reignite in the presence of oxygen. So it's not simply just putting water on the fire to put it out. It's putting water on the fire to put it out, but also smother the ability of that fire to reignite. And that's where we haven't gotten yet with the new foams. But what really does it mean when we talk about the socioeconomic impact of this? We're talking about the impact to regulatory, we're talking about the formulation impacts, we're talking about the manufacturing impacts, the marketing impacts, the consumer impacts, and those are gonna touch all of us. So when we talk about the cost of PFAS treatment and the cost of these regulations, we have to look beyond just the cost of the actual treatment and how much is it gonna cost to dispose of it or transport it. What is it gonna cost us in our pocketbooks by changing all of these formulations? And the new rules that we've all talked about to death while we're here have a big impact of that. You wouldn't think it does, but they do. So the regulatory changes we've talked about here have happened, the biggest ones have happened since 2023. But you can see from January 24th to April 2024, they made huge strides. Everybody was calling April PFAS month because so many regulations changed in the month of April. But those regulations didn't just affect the water or the wastewater industry, they affected commercial real estate, they affected farmers and food producers, manufacturers, transportation companies, retailers, consumers, and the overall economy. Why did it affect real estate? As part of CERCLA passing, one of the real estate changes in there was that any governmental change of ownership of property, any sales, had to include a disclosure for PFAS in the phase 1 site evaluation. Now, in all fairness, ASTM put this into place last year in the commercial phase 1s. They didn't list it as a separate line item, but they did put it in as a contaminant of concern and ask for disclosure. Now that disclosure is demanded. Well, how do you know? We have 3 parts per trillion in our rainwater, and the new regional screening levels that they put out are so low that those regional screening levels are lower than rainwater. And that means that anybody's property could spark those regional screening levels. As my engineer jokes around, he said anything below the 54th parallel is going to test positive for PFAS and the regional screening levels. This means you're going to have delays in closings. It means that you could have a drop in real estate value. It means that there could be cleanup and remediation costs associated with that property. It means that you could have a stalled sale, or in some farmers' cases, the inability to sell. So there's cases in Maine where we've been putting biosolids on farmers' lands for years. It was legal. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what everybody did. But now there's so much PFAS in that land that farmer can't sell it. He can't grow things on it because they've put a limited use on it. He can't put a herd of cattle on there. He can't raise chickens on the farm because the PFAS levels are so high, he technically could be considered a Superfund site, and now you must go through remediation before anything can be done with that land. So this is how it's going to affect the local person. This is how it's going to affect the ground level, because just in that instance, you've had a real estate effect, you've had a food supply effect, and that affects your pocketbook when the food supplies are disrupted. Right now, it is expected that about 20 million acres of farmland across the country have PFAS contamination that actually is higher than what those regional screening levels would dictate. So at any given point, if somebody wanted to come in, they could actually confiscate those farms. We are also having issues with bioaccumulation in our food supply. So they have tested food from oysters right off the coast of Florida. And at one point in time, they found PFAS levels in the oysters at 1 part per billion. They have found it in pineapple. They have found it in oranges. They have found it in our fish, our cattle. It's all bioaccumulating up from being in the ocean, being in the farmland, everywhere. Now, on the commercial side of things, there have been several lawsuits that said you have all natural on your label and you've got PFAS in your product. And this court system has said, well, the manufacturers really aren't responsible for PFAS that they didn't intentionally add to the product. So there has been some consumer protection on that a little bit, but on other ones, they've lost the lawsuits and said, no, figure out how to clean up your product. All of these things are going to raise what we pay at the grocery store. So as I talked about, the regional screening levels really have a major impact on both the food industry and on the real estate industry. They are going to, as we go forward, it's probably going to take about 5 to 10 years, but you'll see a major impact in those as the cost of cleanup gets added into what we have to see and do to protect our food supply. You're also going to see a change in things like formulation changes on things like makeup. As you start talking about intentionally added PFAS, you started affecting things like your laundry detergent. Some of you may have already noticed when you buy fabric softener. When you bought it before and you poured it out, it would be nice and mixed in your jug. But now when you pour it, if you leave it sit, your fabric softener will actually separate. That is a change in formulation. PFAS is in most fabric softeners. It is in most laundry detergents. It's in your cleaners that you use. It's in your lotions. It's in your sunscreen. It's in your bug sprays. All of these will have to have formulation changes, and these don't happen overnight. Formulation changes cost millions to these manufacturers, and so that means that their costs are going to go up, so that means our costs are going to go up. As of March of 2022, there were 578 cosmetic formulations that used 35 different types of PFAS. 2023, when we knew all of this was coming, they were still using 31. So think about that for a minute. That's one section of a product, and they're using 31 different types of PFAS. So if you ban all PFAS, all intentionally added PFAS, every one of those formulations has to be changed to get rid of the PFAS. Or you lose that product in that state, or if we ban it across the country, we lose it in as what we had. So start thinking about the products that you use. The textile sector accounted for 50% of all of the PFAS used because it's in everything. Every time you buy a piece of textile that says waterproof, stain-proof, grease-proof, that's all PFAS. As I said before, what makes a PFAS molecule so horrible is also what has made it so great in the manufacturing industry. It is used to make sure toilet paper doesn't break as it goes through the manufacturing line. Same thing with the Ziploc bag. There's no PFAS in the Ziploc bag, but there's PFAS in the manufacturing of the Ziploc bag. So we have hidden PFAS everywhere. Just at the location that you are sitting, you are probably in contact with about 8 different PFAS. You will see it in semiconductors. The cell phones that we love so much, you can't make the chips without PFAS. You can't make them waterproof without PFAS. So I am not going to stand up here and tell you that they are the best thing on the planet. No, they're horrible for us. But we have to decide as a society how much of our creature comforts do we want to get rid of to eliminate them. According to the National Institute of Health, it's estimated that $37 to $59 billion annually are spent on medically treating cancers that can be directly linked to PFAS. It's estimated that removing PFAS from water nationwide will cost us $1.5 to $3.8 billion annually. So we see these great numbers coming from the government that said, hey, they just put 10 billion here or 5 billion there. That'll probably take us through a few years, and we'll need several more years of that to start really having an impact on cleaning up the PFAS. In 2025, the DoD included $1.5 billion to clean up PFAS just on DoD sites. They've already admitted it's going to take much more than that as they start looking in and doing a reevaluation. CERCLA and the Superfund sites, the private cleanup costs are going to be estimated between 700 and 800 million annually. But these sites are going to take years to clean up. And that's just the current ones. That's not going back and seeing if we need to open up new sites. So the costs associated with PFAS go beyond the environment. They go into what we want to talk about as a society on how much do we want to allow in to still have the cell phones and the computers and everything that has technically advanced our society. And that's really where we need to focus as we go forward. And as we start looking at the PFAS bans, we need to look at their economic impact and creep along rather than push it through all at once, because it's going to take time to make those formulation changes. It's going to take time to figure out how we get those manufacturers to be able to take the PFAS out of their products so that they're not in our environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Are there any comments or questions that could be directed to Tanya? I think the message to take away here is that it's like when you were a kid, you'd end up with a situation where I can't do it, but I have to do it. I can't do it, but I have to do it. We're really in a position where there probably is no ultimate solution. There are practical considerations and practical accommodations and practical solutions that are going to end up having to be woven into the cost and the technical structure. That's why you all are here. Everybody here in this room does a different part of this puzzle. But again, from a purely toxicological standpoint, I'm not sure what the response is, because those numbers are functionally zero for all practical purposes. If you have an analytical sample collected and it's taken to the lab and they don't find PFAS in it, you need to get a new lab. Okay. I think we'll just ease on to the next presentation. And I'd like to introduce Olivia Cain. Olivia is an environmental engineer with Geosyntec. Geosyntec is a company that does everything from the analytical to the evaluation from a toxicological standpoint and the remediation. If she can't do it, she can tell you who within Geosyntec probably can. Olivia?
Good morning. I'm excited to be here. So I am going to talk about the application of forensics tools to differentiate sources and background concentrations of PFAS. And so I have two Geosyntec project examples that I'm going to touch on today. But before I get into those, I just want to provide some context. So I'm going to review information that we have publicly available in Florida about the potential number of sources of PFAS, as well as summarize the UCMR data that's been posted so far in our state. And then I'm just going to really high-level talk about different forensics tools and strategies before getting into the application of those on those specific projects. So starting with potential sources of PFAS in Florida, there's two main sources of information to look at known or potential sources. There's the EPA and then our available state information. So this slide includes a map of the number of locations that EPA has designated as known or suspected sources of PFAS. There's a lot. Shocker. Known sources are those where they've taken a PFAS sample and they've had detections or exceedances. That doesn't necessarily mean that that site where they took that sample is the source of PFAS, and it also doesn't mean that there's a potential risk to receptors. So I just want to sort of caveat that. Additionally, the fact that it's been flagged as a potential source of PFAS doesn't necessarily mean that they've used or released PFAS to the environment. So this is really just a screening tool. But as you can see, there's a lot of different potential or known sources throughout our state. And you'll notice that there tends to be a lot more boxes in places where we have a lot more people. And that makes sense, right? Because PFAS is anthropogenic, so more people equals more potential for PFAS. And we see that same trend with the number of ERIC sites that FDEP has identified for PFAS too. So that's a total of 234 sites. Those are places where we've taken PFAS samples. Again, that doesn't mean that that site is a source of PFAS. It just means that they've taken a PFAS sample and it has an exceedance of the provisional GCTL. And so this list includes sort of those categories that fall into those ERIC sites. And again, you'll see that most of the places where we've collected samples and have an ERIC ID issued are where we have higher population densities and more people. Okay, so this slide, I pulled the UCMR data that's been available and published through the beginning of this month. So UCMR 5 sampling started at the beginning of 2023. If you're not familiar, a little over 400 public water systems are scheduled to complete UCMR sampling. About half of them have completed at least one sampling event. So the UCMR sampling is 12 months of sampling. Larger public water systems have to take quarterly samples. Smaller systems take 2 samples within a 12-month period. So at least 50% of those have at least one sample posted. And then 29% have the full set of compliance monitoring. So that means they've completed their 12 months of sampling, and we have all of the results posted. And now that we have MCLs, EPA has separated them into the unregulated PFAS. So those are the subset of that UCMR list that don't have an MCL, and then now the regulated PFAS. So the PFAS that do have an MCL associated with them. And I know there was a talk given yesterday morning by Tamarin, and she had mentioned occurrence data like this across the United States. Our percentage in Florida is much higher. Right? 30% of our public water systems that have, so that's 30% of the 122 public water systems that have data posted, 34% of them have an exceedance of at least one MCL. And you can see on this slide, I've summarized, which PFAS in particular we are seeing exceedances of. And then the table on the right with the blue shading, those are the other PFAS that are not regulated that we do have detections of in our public water systems. So that means that there are potentially numerous sources, either point or non-point within our state. So that means that if we're collecting samples and assessing for PFAS at our sites, thinking about the potential for background concentrations is really important, because the PFAS that you're detecting around your site or even at your site might not be related to your site activities in the first place. And so trying to delineate to a 4 PPT number can be really challenging. And so thinking about it in the context of this and the context of what a background concentration is going to become a really important player for risk-based closure in our state. So for those who are not familiar with what a background concentration is, and PFAS anthropogenic background concentrations in particular, that's essentially the concentration of PFAS that would exist at a site if there were no known local sources. So just PFAS that would be there naturally because we're people doing our thing, and we've developed in our cities and have been living there. And so to give you all an idea of what types of potential background concentrations we might be seeing in Florida, we reviewed some papers that have been published where samples have been collected across the state, primarily in the central and southern portions of the state, in different aqueous media, where there was not a specific source that they were assessing. So there's samples that are collected that's not associated with like a fire training facility assessment. Just looking at generally what types of concentration ranges are we seeing. And so the table on the top of the slide summarizes that for the 3 media that were sampled. In some areas in the state, we're seeing as much as a couple hundred nanograms per liter of total PFAS. That's pretty significant, right? And they tended to see a correlation of higher concentrations with higher population densities in more developed areas in the state. Again, makes sense. It's an anthropogenic background concentration, so the more people, the more potential there is for a background of PFAS, because there's the more potential for non-point sources. So I think this is another really good example of why thinking about background concentrations, especially when we're sampling in pretty industrialized areas and more developed areas, is going to be really important to drive our assessment and remediation goals. Okay, so a couple people talked about forensics yesterday. I just have one slide about it, just so we're sort of all on the same page with the potential tools that I'm going to talk about and highlight in my case studies. And multiple people yesterday discussed that we should be using multiple lines of evidence. And I totally agree with that, because our ultimate goal is to develop a cohesive, defensible, and compelling story that fits our data and our conceptual site model and what we're seeing. And the best way to do that, especially with PFAS being so complex and prevalent in the environment, is to look at multiple lines of evidence and use multiple tools. Some of those tools are not new. We use them for other contaminants. Some of them are PFAS specific. Some of them are still developing, like fate and transport modeling, toxicity information, that's still developing for PFAS, but they can still be applied with other more conventional tools to be able to tell the story and put our data into context. And so a few of these I'm going to highlight in the 2 case studies for the rest of my presentation. So I have 2 examples. One is a small data set where we used more qualitative tools. The other one is a much larger data set where we had to use more advanced tools. So sort of trying to represent the more extreme ends of the spectrum. And given the interest of time, I've really simplified them. So especially when we get to the more complicated case study, I just want to caveat that these are very technical evaluations that can take a lot of time and require a lot of expertise, but really not getting too much in the weeds. And they've also been anonymized for the purpose of presenting. So the first site is an industrial site that had historic metal finishing operations that occurred from the 1950s to the 1990s. Metal finishing at that site included forming, welding, grit blasting, surface finishing, but there was never a record that they did electroplating. And that's a known source of PFAS for folks who are familiar. So that's important to note. And this site in particular had been undergoing decades of assessment and remediation from metals in soil and VOCs in groundwater associated with those metal finishing activities. And about the time that they were trying to pursue a conditional closure, the regulatory agency had implemented screening levels that were consistent with the 2016 HALs of 70 nanograms per liter for PFOS, PFOA, and the summation of those 2. And so the site got flagged for PFAS sampling in the midst of trying to pursue that closure. And so we did some initial screening, ended up installing more wells, and of course, we found PFAS. And to just put it sort of into context, there were a total of 18 water table monitoring wells, 32 wells total. All 18 monitoring wells had detections of PFAS. And I want to say it was like 16 or 17 had an exceedance of the provisional HAL. So pretty widespread. There's also some other complexities about the hydrogeology at this site. Groundwater is super shallow. The site sits between 2 water bodies. So the groundwater flow direction is really influenced by seasons, tides, the time of day. And so there's a lot of surface water, groundwater interaction that can play into contaminant transport. So this slide summarizes the data. So essentially each dot is a sample where we collected a groundwater sample at a monitoring well. Green dots are that the sample was below the 70 nanograms per liter. The other 3 colors represent exceedances, and the highest concentrations are in the red dots and the orange dots. So if you look at this, our highest concentrations are not where our historic release area is, right? Our VOC plume, which is in the central portion of the site where the building used to be, is sort of up, this is like up gradient and side gradient of where we actually see our highest concentrations. So that's kind of funky, that doesn't really make sense. So what the state asked us to do was like, okay, well, we want you to do a data evaluation to like really figure out what's going on, but let's try to collect some more samples and see if we can delineate it offsite. So we put in some more wells, did not delineate. So this red blob is sort of our inferred extent of PFAS and PFOA. We had some access restrictions to the south, so we weren't actually able to collect any more samples side or down gradient of this high concentration well cluster, but we were able to get some more samples to the north. And so we needed to employ some forensics tools to be able to explain what we're seeing. Concentration distribution didn't fit with our understanding of the conceptual site model and groundwater flow direction. And looking at the data a little bit more closely, the high concentration well kind of looked like AFFF. And if you've looked at a lot of PFAS data, it's pretty obvious when you see something that's AFFF related. So we just did some Google searching, seeing if we could find something publicly available that might explain why we're seeing that high concentration and if there's a potential offsite source. And that actually worked. So this this photo on the bottom is from a news article that was published, and you can actually see our site in the photo. So this circle is where this well cluster is, and what happened was a few tankers filled with ethanol spilled over as they were crossing the railroad tracks adjacent to our site. The fire department responded to that incident, and to avoid a potentially catastrophic fire, they applied AFFF over the spill area. And so we notified the regulatory agency. They contacted their emergency response department, and they found the incident report. And so that confirmed what we saw in these photos are from that incident report. So the signature that we were seeing in these high concentrations that looked like AFFF, that's because it was from AFFF. And so the initial reaction from the state was to say all the PFAS at our site is from that one release. But knowing that this cluster is sort of side gradient to the rest of the wells at the site, we didn't feel like that was telling the whole story. So we implemented some traditional forensics tools using a compositional evaluation of PFAS. So this is looking at the percent composition of the 8 PFAS that were detected in most of the samples. Some folks yesterday presented a similar evaluation using radar plots and pie charts. So those are just other ways to visualize this same information. I like bar charts because I like the colors. I think it's a little bit easier to see. And so I have noted 2 specific categories. So this is every single water table well. We did do this evaluation for all depth intervals, but the water table data kind of tells the best story. So these 2 bars on the right side of the slide are the samples that are associated with our AFFF source. So that's the well cluster to the south with the highest concentrations. And then these other 3 are our on-site wells that are closest to our historic release area. And what you'll notice, and if you're maybe thinking, this doesn't look like this. And all of this looks very different. So that tells us 2 things. One, yes, this is right. This looks exactly like AFFF. So the high concentrations adjacent to the spill were influenced by that release. And so what we're seeing at that site cluster is the result of an AFFF release. But because the signatures on site don't look like the AFFF source well, and they can't be explained like potential breakdown of PFAS. So sometimes you'll see like short chains moving faster than long chains, or like different transport times for PFCAs versus PFAAs, and so sometimes the signature can be different, but it can be explained by those properties. That's not what we were seeing here. So that tells us that what we're seeing on site is not from the AFFF, but also because there's so much variability with all of these on-site samples, as well as the down gradient and side gradient samples from our release area. That means that there's no obvious site-specific signature. So it's likely that the PFAS that's present here and around the site could be from multiple other sources, could be from a background signature, but it's just not very compelling to indicate that it's related to our site in particular. So just to summarize, these were the 2 questions we were trying to answer. Is the AFFF release the only source of PFAS to our site? The answer is no. our understanding of groundwater flow direction, that doesn't really make sense. We wouldn't expect contaminants to migrate in that way, but also the signature of AFFF that we saw at that well cluster doesn't look like the stuff that we saw on site. So it doesn't appear that the PFAS was related. And then the second question was our site a source of PFAS? And again, the answer is no. They didn't do any electroplating. We did a historic, extensive document review. We didn't identify any documentation that they performed any activities or used any PFAS-containing materials. And then our compositional analysis had a lot of variability in it, and there was no sort of obvious site-specific signature that could be attributed to a release at our site. And so we presented that to the regulatory agency, and they agreed. And now the property owner is actually continuing with their conditional closure associated with the metals and VOCs, and they are not responsible for the PFAS that is present at their site. So happy ending for the property owner. Okay, so case study number 2. This is also an industrial site, but it happens to be one where we know it's a source of PFAS. They've had lots of releases over decades from the 1960s. We've been completing extensive assessment, both at the site and regionally, to assess the presence of PFAS. And the site happens to sit near a water body that has a lot of connectivity via surface water and groundwater. So we've got a lot of potential contaminant migration via groundwater flow and surface water flow. Through the course of our investigations, we've taken over 1,000 groundwater samples, so really big data set. And in the middle of us doing our investigation, they sampled the potable wells up gradient in the nearby city, and they had detections of PFAS. And so the question became, are the detections of PFAS in that potable well related to this known source and known release of PFAS at our site? So we used a couple different tools to help answer that question. The first one is much more straightforward. It's, would it make sense for groundwater or surface water to transport PFAS to that area? So we separated our sites based on region, and the regions are defined by the hydraulic connectivity of groundwater and surface water. So the site is shown in green, and the 3 areas that have the highest connection and highest potential for contaminant transport are the 2 blue colors, the dark and the light, and the purple. The orange color area, which is where our potable wells are, and the pink area are those that have little or no connection via surface water and groundwater. So those are areas where we would not expect contaminant transport to be happening. So then we took all of the samples that we had collected and plotted them based on these regions as well. So this is a box and whisker plot, and each of the bars represents the different regions. Each dot is an individual sample. The concentrations that are listed at the top is the median concentration for each regional data set. And then you can see the median concentrations represented by the box and whisker plot as well. And the bars that are in this dashed box correlate with the zones that are most connected via groundwater and surface water to our site. So they're the areas where we would traditionally consider that to be the footprint of our groundwater plume. And so what you see is that, of course, highest concentrations are on site, and then as you move away from the site, we're seeing decreasing concentrations. We're also seeing the higher of the decreasing concentrations in the 2 zones where we have the best connectivity. That makes sense, right? Best potential contaminant transport, you see the most contaminant transport from the site, and then you see less in these regional areas, but still pretty elevated. So this doesn't perfectly explain yes or no to that question, right? It's just sort of like thinking about it in the context of, is it possible for this PFAS to come from our site? Probably not, but having multiple lines of evidence is good. So we used an advanced fingerprinting technique called a principal component analysis. Who knows what a principal component analysis is? Ooh, okay. So it's fancy. It's a multivariate statistical tool, and you put in your inputs, and what it gives you as an output is essentially a 2D or 3D plot. But it looks at, in the context of PFAS, it looks at all of the PFAS data at all of our samples and tries to sparse out what explains the most variability within the data set, and that variability is called a principal component. So usually we're trying to target between 2 and 4 principal components that explain most of the variability, and a principal component is not necessarily an individual PFAS. So it could be that one principal component that explains a lot of variability is you have a couple PFAS that are really high and a couple PFAS that are really low, and so it'll plot that in this 2D or 3D visualization. So essentially, if the dots are near each other or on top of each other, they're more similar to each other. And if they're further away, that means they're less similar to each other and more different and have a different signature. And at this site in particular, just based on the number of samples we had, the number of PFAS, and the variability that we did see, we ended up with 3 principal components that were driving the variability of our data. So this is just a 2D screenshot of a 3D plot, and I have a video so we can see it moving around and it'll look a little bit easier. But we ended up color coding it based on these regions. So what we're hoping to see is which colors associated with these different regions and these different connectivity zones plot closest to our site data. So what colored dots are going to be closest to the green dot that is our site data? And again, I just want to caveat, a PCA is very complicated, and it's really nuanced. And environmental samples often don't plot perfectly because there's a lot of variability in the environment, especially with PFAS. So it's, it takes some expertise and experience to be able to interpret it. But this is an example of a screenshot of the on-site data compared to the down gradient samples. It may not look like it, but they are plotted pretty similarly, and you'll see it better in the video. And then this next slide shows all the data. Okay, so it's adding each of the sample categories, and then we're rotating it. So notice how the cooler colors, the green and the blues and the purple, they're all kind of like stuck on the wall of the plot. Whereas when you rotate it, you see that the orange and pink samples are kind of further away. That's what we're talking about when we talk about things that are plotting similar to each other and things that are plotting away from each other. So what that tells us is that the signature on site looks like these areas, the signatures in the areas where we would expect contaminant transport to happen. And the signatures where we would not expect contaminant transport to happen based on flow direction for groundwater and surface water don't look like our data. So that tells us that the PFAS that's up here is not our PFAS. It's somebody else's PFAS. Maybe it's just the region's PFAS, right? But the potable well exceedances couldn't be explained by our release of PFAS. And so we presented this information to the regulatory agency, and they agreed with us. So based on just our understanding of the conceptual site model, fate and transport of groundwater, and contaminant transport, as well as just sort of like the general distribution of concentrations, it didn't really make sense for PFAS to be migrating up gradient from the site to the potable wells. But that was further supported by our fingerprinting analysis, not looking similar to our site data. So that means that now this site, so they agreed, and the PFAS that's up gradient, it does not fall within like our defined plume. It is not our client's responsibility. Okay, so some key takeaways, just revisiting these tools. I just wanted to reiterate that while environmental forensics, especially for PFAS, can be complicated and are developing, they can still be very relevant to your site and can still be really useful to answer some of these big questions about potential liability. We should be looking at multiple lines of evidence. That's a good best practice, but the more lines of evidence you can point to, the better your story, the more compelling and defensible it is. And using these tools is not always appropriate, but when we use them, They can be helpful to sparse out background concentrations. So in our state, I think that's going to be really important in our more populated areas, and they can help drive what our assessment and remediation strategies are as well. So, thank you.
I don't think these are on.
Yeah, I didn't know.
There you go.
You described the use of principal component analysis. Been around for a while, but it's getting a lot more attention now because of its ability to, as you said, tease out different parts of this question. Has your experience been that the regulatory agencies are I guess, sufficiently familiar with it to understand it when you present it? And I don't mean understand in a non-technical way, but what has been their willingness to use that information to help decide site-specific decisions?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I would agree that it's probably a newer tool for most regulators. So developing good content to be able to explain the really highly technical nature of it has been really useful. But they've been open to listening. And I think just pointing to the fact that it's a tool that's commonly used in like PFAS litigation, for example, in cases where they've made decisions, I think helps make it more compelling. It's not like we're using completely new science, we're just applying it in a different way. And having a combination of sort of more complicated things like a PCA with things that they're more familiar with to tell the story, those multiple lines of evidence, I think helps sell it to them and explain it better, because it's a combination of things that maybe they're not familiar with, but then things that are more tangible to them because those are things that they're used to seeing. It's more like traditional assessment tools.
Any other questions for Olivia? A couple back in the back. Go ahead. Well, thanks, Norbert.
Hi, I'm Clint with CDM. I really appreciate and like that the well graphs you had for that one case study where you had the percentage of each PFAS analyte per well and the source zone downgraded and all that. That's awesome. I might have to steal that. But and that's a great way to start looking at causation and where PFAS is coming from in signatures. But have you, in those groundwater studies, or that study that you've done and maybe others, have you considered precursor transformation in those PFAS analyte concentrations that you're seeing? Because we've done, and I'm not saying I have all the answers, but we've looked at PFAS as it's coming into wastewater plants, the raw water, and then what's coming out in the effluent across the U.S. And sometimes what we see is like the signature is completely different coming out the other end of the plant, and we actually see PFAS analytes on the effluent side that were never even detected on the raw water, and it's there's something chemically going on. Yeah, I've seen that in wastewater data as well. I think wastewater systems, they're different than just like a natural environmental system, because there's mechanisms that are going on beyond just like the natural state. But absolutely, we should be thinking about potential precursor transformation when looking at our compositional analysis, and thinking about how fate and transport properties like sorption and mobility can play into there being different signatures. And we did consider that for that case study, and that's often what we'll look at too, because sometimes it can explain the variability. It's just at that site in particular, it didn't explain the variability. There happened to be no pattern with groundwater flow direction or spatial distribution with short chain versus long chain PFAS or PFCAs versus PFAAs. So that told us that there's not any sort of like transformation happening at that site in particular. Also just based on, we don't really know what kind of AFFF there is. So not all AFFF sources have precursors to transform. And so that site in particular, there were no precursors at all. It was only sort of the more longer chain or more mobile PFAS. So does that answer your question? Okay, good.
Yeah, very good. I enjoyed your talk. With respect to the anthropogenic backgrounds, that the state of Florida agreed with your analysis that it wasn't due to the facility you're looking at. If they were exceeding MCLs, who did they go after? Or did they go after anybody? Or does the risk just continue on with no one addressing it?
Sure. That's a great question. The first site happens to be in Florida, but I won't say where. So what they ended up doing is that we know that there's an obvious source of PFAS because of the release. Those folks are conducting an assessment associated with the AFFF release. The rest of the PFAS has not been assigned. The liability of it hasn't been assigned to anybody in particular. So there hasn't been like an official decision made about how to continue exploring those concentrations and defining whether they're background and whether they're regional. Because really they were just focused on trying to get the property owner an answer to continue their conditional closure process. You're welcome.
Is there one more question?
For the case study 1, was there also soil analytical data that was provided to distinguish between the AFFF and what was on site to show that there were no sources on site that could have migrated vertically?
Yes, we did take soil, surface water, and sediment samples. The primary driver at the site was definitely in groundwater. Really nothing in soil that made you jump up and down as a potential source. It also, the detections that we had in the soil were all over the place. So there wasn't necessarily like a pattern, but as part of the remedial efforts for the VOCs and the metals, they dug up a lot of the property. So even if there had been a release at the site of PFAS that was associated with that site in particular, they likely would have excavated it. And so the soil data sort of supported that. We didn't have any sort of on-site source in the sediment or in the soil. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Olivia. I know there was another question in the back. If it's possible, maybe you guys can get together afterwards. Thank you very much for that. I think what Olivia also pointed out is that this principal component analysis, technical though it may be, kind of puts a quantitative orientation to what we sort of look at when we see data at a site. We get a feel for the data pretty quickly, but being able to put a quantitative spin on it is usually very useful from a persuasion perspective. And by the way, the question in the back, ripping off is the sincerest form of flattery. Okay, the next presentation is an overview of PFAS in aquatic environments, what we know so far, and major gaps. Dr. Natalia Soares-Quinete, assistant professor at Florida International University.
Thank you, Chris, for a nice introduction. So actually, good morning, everybody. I'm actually going to have to probably leave a little bit after my talk, so hopefully I'm going to be able to answer some questions, but if not, my email is here. Feel free to reach out. So I'm going to be presenting today some of the work that has been conducted in my lab at FIU by my students. So I kind of feel like everybody already knows about PFAS, so I'm going to go a little bit quicker in these first slides. So of course we know they have been present in a wide range of products, household, commercial applications, and they're I like to say that because I think a lot of people, we talk about PFAS, and some people talk about the chemistry, and I just wanted to emphasize, those chemicals are a little bit different from the traditionals, like metals, PCBs, and they are more lipophilic. So because of their very unique, they are both hydrophobic, carbon fluoride chain, as well as the functional group that's very hydrophilic. And because of that, they're very propense to bend to protein. That's one of the reasons, I think nobody has mentioned, at least that I heard it, but they have been also found in 99% of the population in their blood. So, and one of these reasons that they have been associated, I think we have been mentioned before, to a variety of health effects, 10 types of cancers, to affect thyroid, also to affect reproduction system as well as immune system. You know, Olivia already showed this figure before, so this is basically, I like to show that just to show like all the potential sources of exposure pathway. And you're gonna see that I'm gonna talk a lot about like, you know, some of the sources. I mean, we don't, not that I know of any PFAS producing companies, but I mean, we do have airports, we do have impact from leachate from landfills, and also biosolids are used in the farm, so those chemicals can be uptaken by plants, or can they also leach, end up in our groundwater, and eventually into our drinking water, right? And of course, coming from wastewater treatment plants. These also already have been made kind of like what we have so far in terms of regulation has been recently established. You know, the proposed MCLs now are, you know, the enforced MCLs. You know, just wanted to remind a little bit. So why South Florida? So I started my position back in 2020, and at the same time, you know, we have the environmental working group collected a few samples of, you know, drinking water from water facilities from different states. And this is one of the headlines back then, you know, that Miami was actually the third highest concentration of PFAS in drinking water. So of course, that's something that most of the folks here didn't even know what PFAS was back then, right? Like they started like 2019 to 2020. Getting a little bit more acquaintance. I have been researching this chemical since my Ph.D. back in 2006, so quite some time. So we did back then, just to have an idea before we even started doing research, like, okay, what do we know so far? So this is a map that we put together from a review paper that my group wrote. So we kind of look at in what we had, and just to emphasize, I know like the map might be not the best. You know, there was very few, you know, assessments back then. So most of them were closer to military air bases. So you can see that even here, you see like in South Florida, most of the levels here, you can see that are surpassing 10,000. These are mostly from like groundwater samples that were collected closer to military air bases. So these are why the high levels, but there were very few studies back then. And you can see like, you know, probably if you were to update that, we probably have a better idea from different locations. So everything white here is like, we didn't find any study back then. That was in 2020. So we saw like there is a lot of lack of knowledge in terms of, okay, where are those PFAS, what are their sources, where are they distributed, you know, what are their composition, and, you know, trying to understand a little bit more what are their potential impacts into the environment and human health. So back then, we started in 2020, so not a very easy time, if you all remember. And we started collecting samples from tap water, you know, from residences or from some of the commercial business. So we started collecting, especially from the most urbanized areas, so Miami-Dade County, Broward, and Palm Beach. And, you know, we also, one of the more major you know, water bodies is Biscayne Bay, so probably some of you guys know about that. So we start collecting also some of the canals that is charging to the bay. So we're interested to see, like, are there any PFAS? So what are those, and, you know, what concentrations we're seeing in. And we expanded at some point a little bit later also to different environments. So we collect some samples in Tampa Bay, we collect some samples in the Everglades National Park and some of the canals, and we also collected some samples in Key West. And we also expanded tap water samples, so we started collecting a little bit, some samples in the western side, you know, and as well as more central Florida. And knowing it, and I think, like, you know, I might be like fast forwarding, But so this is more recent study that we have recently published. So we saw there was PFAS coming from the canals, and I'm going to show you guys the results very soon. But then one of my students, we said, okay, let's try to see how this PFAS behave once they get discharged into the bay. So what are the concentration profile? Do they change it over time until they go offshore, And this is what we are trying to answer, and also how they bioaccumulated in some of our recreational fisheries. So we collected about 30 tuna and 30 fish. I'm not going to be able to, there's a lot of data. I'm not going to be able to probably get into much into deep, but I'm going to be just showing some of the interesting results so far. And we know that wildlife, some specific species that have been widely used at biomonitoring or bioindicators from environmental contamination or overall health from the ecosystem. So especially bivalves, filter feeding, like oysters, mussels, and clam, they have been very good sentinels, basically because they don't move. That's one of the things. And they, of course, they're filtering all this water from the ocean, right? So they tend to bioaccumulate a lot of chemicals in it. So we collected also about 156, so I think it was probably our study that was mentioned before about the oysters contaminated in Florida, because that's the only study that we have so far in oysters, as well as the background concentrations in drinking surface water. This is also something that I'm going to be showing you. So we collected right in a backyard, here in FIU, so some oysters, some American oysters from there. We collected also from Terracea in Tampa, from this farm. And we collected also in central eastern part in Marco Island. So let's go a little bit. I'm not going to talk too much about the methodology. I think you probably all are more interested in what the results are. But we started with using a method that we're assessing 30 PFAS, so similar to the 537.1 from EPA. Nowadays, we are expanding it, especially for groundwater and for surface water. We're using the 40 PFAS, 6033. And this is basically just a workflow for that from SPE preparation into analysis by LC-MS. And the tissue samples, we do have a different protocol that we have been using in the lab. So we do destruction using, as you can see here, what we call a tissue miser. So this is an ultrasonic probe where we do destructions. And this is following, instead of we using a SPE but not a cartridge, we use a dispersive SPE process. Again, with graphitize carbon black, as well as we use a fluorosil to try to remove a little bit more the fatty acids, which has been very successful so far. And again, analysis by LCMS. So finally going to the results. What do we know so far? So this is the first assessments that we did in tap water. So again, very similar to what was presented before as the background levels, right, in tap water. So we saw concentrations all the way from about 1 to 231 for the sum of PFAS. And it was very interesting to see, you see one of the highest concentration here. Let me show here. Grapeland Heights, that was the one that was the closest location to Miami Airport. And another one of the highest one, Dania Beach, closer to Fort Lauderdale Airport. And we were able to identify some of the major PFAS that we've been found in tap water, like PFBA, PFOS, and PFPEA. And of course, if you look at here, for this one, that has a lot of nice colors, I know, but this one here, in Grapeland Heights, you can see the little pink here is 6.2 FTS, so it has already been mentioned before, So that has been related to AFFF. So this study, just to let you know, we have been expanding it. This is recent, I said, one of my ongoing study with this graduate student. So she has been expanding it. So we have been collecting a lot more samples in different zip codes in Miami. And I mean, she has collected more, but the data that I'm going to be presenting is from 50 tap waters in 14 different zip codes. And as you can see here, like maybe, again, it's not for the whole Florida, it's more for our area. And if you look at this graph here, I know that is a lot of things you're probably not going to be able to distinguish. So she tried to plot here the box plot from different zip codes. But I think it's pretty clear if you look at here, this is PFOA and PFOS. And this is the line where we have our MCLs, right? So this is slow, it's not proposed anymore. But here you can see that in 100% of our samples, we actually have the levels of PFOS above the 4 part per trillion. And for PFOA, we had in 43% of their samples. And the highest concentrations from those zip codes, at least, that we collected, it was for, as you can see here, for 6.2 FTS, especially for those. You see, like some of them are very low, but at least there's 3 ones here, which again were collected closer to the Homestead area, show a really high level. So we also did the hazard index calculation for the zip code. So we can see besides PFOA, PFOS, we can see that some of these areas, right, like from zip codes in Miami, that also show the hazard index of both one. So. And going back a little bit, remember that I showed that we collected from different areas, not only here in Miami-Dade, but also we started to collect some of the areas in other counties a little bit. So if you can see here in this graph, it's very clear, right? Like from this, that the East Coast from South Florida seems to have like higher concentration in tap water. So I don't know if it's more reassuring for those of you that lives more up central or western, but this is what we have been seeing so far. And going now for the surface water samples, so we collected first again from the canals that discharge into the bay. And again, the total level is very similar to what Olivia just showed us, right? So from around 8 to 108 nanograms per liter in surface water. We saw that we identified some of the major culprits, for those going to say that had like the higher sum of PFAS. So Biscayne Canal 8, Little River, and Miami River here in the Seaboard Canal. And again, we saw, PFOS again, one of the higher levels was PFOS, PFHXA, and PFPA. So, I'm just showing this because like one of our goals were like, okay, we're trying to identify what are the major compounds, the major PFAS, all of those different samples there we are being analyzed, kind of a prioritization, to do a prioritization way. So here you can see all the data that we collect from the different systems. So if you ignore for now, and I'm going to be talking soon about this, but if you can see that the highest concentrations were found in Biscayne Bay, following them by Tampa Bay, and in average, and then the Everglades National Park canals, and the lowest concentration was found in Key West. And this high concentration, it was a very interesting situation. Let me show you guys. So we collected, as you can see here, in this canal that comes all the way from the Everglades National Park here, C103, the data is here. And this canal flow all the way here, passing through about 2 kilometers from the Homestead Air Base until discharge here. So we collected exactly at that point here. And as you can see, there is some, suggestion that we might be having some runoff potentially from the air base that has been contributing to this higher level at this point. These are the results that I told you guys before that we collected along the bay, kind of trying to understand a little bit more about the dispersion of PFAS in the bay, and also we collected in the surface in the bottle, so we're trying to see what is the deep water profile from these compounds. As you can see here, in general, what we are seeing, the highest concentrations closer to the canals, and it started decreasing it, so we have some dilution going on here. So you can see like in the offshore areas, the concentrations are lower. And in general, what we have is the concentration in the surface is higher compared to the bottle. So the bottle we collect about like 4 meters. The bay is not actually that deep. And in offshore, we actually collected in around 4 and a little bit more deeper, like about 8 meters. So this is what we saw, but there were some areas very interesting to show that we didn't really see that much of this decline. So one of the assumptions would be like maybe some more, PFAS coming out from resuspension from sediments is one of the options, or maybe we have some potential wastewater infiltration, something that is might be going on there that probably needs a little bit more investigation. We haven't been assessing the sediments yet, so that's something to come. And we saw that the northern side of the bay, it was showing the highest concentration when compared to the southwest part. And here in this other graph here on the right, what we see is, this is a model, is an inverse distance weighted interpolation that was used. That my students have applied, so based on the concentration that we obtain, we're trying to forecast what would be the concentration the rest of the bay. So this is very easy to interpret, like all the red spot here, this is where the highest concentrations are, like where the sources, and you can see like how they are dispersing it. And all the green areas here, that's the ones that are showing the lowest concentration of PFAS. So we always have been talking here, I know that some people mention about rainwater, right? Coming from atmospheric deposition, and this is some of the data we actually been collecting also in Miami on that. So we know that they're coming from wastewater, we know they're coming from landfills, from military air bases, airport, but then we decided to have a look, okay, how much of those things are actually coming from rainwater. So this is a study that we already submitted for publication, is under revision. So my student here, she looked at then, PFAS along the whole year. So she collected rainwater, and you can see here we have data from both, everything here in yellow is a dry season, and then in green, light green, I don't know if it's green or dark green. So this is the wet season. And it was very interesting to see, like, so she plotted here the flux of PFAS, as well as together with the data from the sum of PFAS. So we can see that, the flux of PFAS, as well as the highest sum of PFAS, were found during the dry season, which again kind of have some evidence of this scavenging effect of the rainwater that actually is playing a big role here on the concentration of PFAS in rainwater. And very interesting as well, I'm going to show you guys, is we did look at the air masses, so the back trajectory from the air masses from the past 5 days, and at 3 different levels above the ground level, so at 500, 1,500, and 3,000. And it was interesting to see this graph here on the top, that is when we saw the highest concentration of PFAS and in rainwater in our study. And the one here in the bottom is where we found the lowest concentration. So it's interesting to see that when we saw the highest concentration of PFAS, the major players here was like northwestern air masses. And the one in the bottom, we can see that the lowest concentration, whenever we saw the lowest concentration of PFAS in rainwater, that was like the highest, the air masses were actually coming from southeastern. Kind of shows you like where the sources are, right? So should we be concerned? So based on the calculations, based on the concentration that we found in tap water, we calculated what would be the hazard index. So we estimated the daily intake of PFAS by individual PFAS, and we calculated a hazard index. So the hazard index, as you can see here for individual PFAS, they are below, like considering the average values, they are below 1. So that would be like, okay, there's no risk. But if you consider that the highest concentrations, and if you consider that you're not only exposed to 1, if you sum the hazard index from all the different compounds that we have data reference those from, we actually get, in some cases, that the hazard index could actually be something to be concerned about it. So what about the oysters? So we already talked about here that we saw some data in oysters, right? So here is, again, a box plot from the different locations, different type of PFAS. So we can see that American oysters have been exposed to a wide variety, through the Florida coasts, and we saw especially some higher concentrations. You can see here from PFBA. Oh, sorry. So from PFBA, PFOS, and PFTDA. So this one here, PFTEDA, this is one of the very long chains, right? So we can see that, again, Biscayne Bay seems to be the one that has the highest concentration. So are PFAS affecting the oysters? To check that, what we did is we measured a biometric. So we measure like shell thickness, like their weight, height, and there is a couple of things called like condition index. So there are several ways for you to calculate that. We did some statistical tests, some experiment correlation, and it was very interesting to see that the sum of PFAS have very strong and negative correlation, with the C1, condition index 1, as well as you can see here with animal weight, shell thickness. So this kind of gives us an indication, right, that the highest concentration of PFAS were actually in smaller animals that we found, and that has the shell, like their very thinner shell thickness. So that kind of like have us to believe a little bit that, at least like some indication that, PFAS might be actually impacting it, the shell, it might be impacting oysters' health. So again, we apply some statistical tests to look at, are there any significant difference between the 3 locations that we sampled the oysters from? Again, we found, Biscayne Bay is the one, that showed significant higher concentration in relation to the other 2 locations. So the only oysters that people actually eat, let's be honest, nobody eats oysters from Biscayne Bay, but the locations where we had, it was from from Terracea. This is like oyster farm. They actually produce for consumption, so people buy oysters there. And we look at, again, we calculated the estimated daily intake and also calculated a hazard index or hazard risk from eating those oysters. And you can see that we have 2 columns here just to be we calculated for highly consumers of seafood, so they have like a estimation of highly consumers as well for the rest of the, population. And again, as you can see, the concentrations, all of them were well below 1. So this would be an indication that the risk of consuming PFAS through oysters, all of the guys that love oysters, is actually low. But the only thing I wanted to point it out is like, look at this, is only 4 compounds that we have referenced those toxicology data from. So there is again, I don't know if we were being like probably very conservative, not very conservative here. So we probably underestimated the concentration, the risk, because we don't really have toxicological data for the reference dose for the majority of the compounds that we have been detecting in the study. So again, I mentioned to you guys that from Biscayne Bay, there's a lot of recreational fishery going on. You're probably aware of that. And we have collected, in collaboration with some recreational anglers, they collected both tuna and lobster for us. And we compared those levels with the surface water. So we calculated some what we call like bioaccumulation factors. And what we saw is, again, for both of them, we saw the highest bioaccumulation in lobster was found in lobster for C9. So here is being organized by carbon chain length. So you can see that here the highest one for C9. But very interesting was that we saw that the shorter chain is also showing to be bioaccumulating in both tuna and lobster. So I hope I'm not gonna passing too much of my time. So just some take-home message. We have seen that the Florida coast has been impacted, especially Biscayne Bay. That's one of our study sites. We have identified some of the sources, such as airport, the Biscayne canals, military air bases, but we cannot forget that we're getting also from atmospheric deposition, so we're also getting from rainwater, and we have identified some of the predominant PFAS and all this type of samples. So these are the ones here. We saw that PFAS are accumulating also in marine organisms, and they could be impacting their overall health. The risk assessment kind of showed that the risk is low, but this should be, again, interpreted kind of carefully, because we're still lacking a lot of information toxicological from the majority of the PFAS. Just to let you guys know, we have been in my lab, assessing a lot more different type of matrix, like wastewater, e-waste, biosolids, sharks, manatees, and we are even starting collaborating with some people on remediation efforts as well. And in terms of Biscayne Bay, we're gonna be further collecting more samples. We're trying to identify what are the sources of those chemicals in this canal, so we're gonna be trying to identify what are the hotspots and where they can be coming from. I just like to thank you. These are, some of the people from my, these are all, this research, wouldn't be possible without all these amazing people, so all of my students, and also I'm gonna like to thank NSF for funding through the Institute of Environment request, and again, my email, in case I'm not gonna be able to answer your question today, feel free to reach out to me. Then, thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. We have time for a quick question if someone has one.
Yeah.
Yeah, you.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the work that you and your students are doing. It's important,
Yes.
especially for the folks who live and work in South Florida, which is where my question lies. Have you shared any of your data with the Florida Department of Health or the local pollution control program, Miami-Dade County, Durham? And if so, are they engaged? Are they concerned about the results, about your findings?
So yeah, good question. So we published back then like their first publications on PFAS. I did have like some interesting talks with both like Miami-Dade sewage water department as well as Durham. So and I think there was somebody from FDP. I'm not sure now. But like they are aware, and we have been trying to collaborate actually together with them, with the water facilities on this. They kind of like shutting down a little bit. I think like they're getting sued because of PFAS. So that's another biggest issue right now because, I mean, we're trying to answer like some important research questions, and it's always good to have this collaboration. But most of the research that I present here today has already been published. I think like that's one of the reasons that, Olivia, already mentioned that, and, that was mentioned in other talks here today. So I'm pretty sure they are aware. And I have given other talks where there's some people from Florida DEP. So I would say like they know it. Even though we haven't been, but I have to admit like we haven't been really having meetings. And this is one of the things that, that I think it should be, it's hard to know, but for example, we have started a while back, and I feel like right now there's a lot of incoming research going on in Florida. So for example, I didn't know about the study that Olivia was mentioning, and I think like it would be very good for at some point in time that we sit together. I'm not only from Florida DEP, but I'm saying like for everybody that is involved in research in Florida as well, so to sit together and try to see like instead of us kind of like maybe doing like similar work, that we actually complement each other, like because sometimes like it takes some time until you get things published, right? So sometimes we might be just replicating efforts instead of like complementing each other. So I think at some point we should be creating some sort of coalition or some type of group in Florida with everybody that is doing research or doing assessment or even remediation at some point that we can better discuss things and to move forward. Sorry.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thanks, Natalia. You should probably talk to Gene Jones, see if we could put together a conference for you, so everybody could get together. By the way, as your toxicologist, I recommend against filter feeders. The next presentation is Stephen Luzkow, navigating PFAS through the environmental due diligence process. He's Technical Director of Partner Engineering and Science, Inc. Stephen?
Oh, it's an honor to be here today. What I'm going to be talking about is where actually all of this within the CRE market, where the rubber hits the road. Maybe I shouldn't use the term rubber. It's got PFAS in it sometimes. So anyway, as we move along with this, and I have to figure this out. Oh, okay, got it. All right, so what is environmental due diligence? How many people here have written a phase one? That is excellent. So you probably know the issues that we have in terms of interpreting all of the legal issues with the state and the federal government in terms of it now with two PFAS components being hazardous chemicals. But when we integrate PFAS into the big picture and the goal of environmental due diligence, it's important to understand that this is where the CRE market is impacted. It both impacts lenders, investors, property owners and sellers, and buyers. And where we look at this from a borrower standpoint, when they're looking at buying property, what is their interest? Their interest is, what is my cash flow? What's going to happen if I find out I have contamination? Universal, not necessarily to PFAS, but it's a universal requirement, or a universal question. For lenders, their interest in the credit review is, can the borrower repay that debt? What is their cash flow for environmental issues? When they go into default, the lender's interest is, what is my recovery? And they look at marketability. So on that side of the market, they have an interest in what the impact could be, not only of other hazardous substances, but particularly also the emerging contaminants that include PFAS. When we look at other due diligence tools, ignore these when it comes to actual protections provided under CERCLA. They won't provide it. These are typically used for underwriting reviews done by lenders. When I think about what we use as the gold standard in due diligence to initially determine whether there's a spinoff to conduct a phase two that looks at PFAS, What are we looking at? We're looking at the conclusions that come through those documentation that results in 3 obvious conclusions and one that's a little far off. Recognized environmental condition. It means likely or known presence of contamination of a hazardous substance above residential use, regardless of whether the property is commercial or industrial. Controlled rec. I have levels that are between residential or commercial. My property is commercial. Well, in some states it's acceptable to accept that contamination there with no remediation because my control as a controlled rec is the fact that the property is going to remain commercial use, and that leaves that control in play. When I look at a historical rec, we're not going to see that with PFAS too soon. As time goes on, we're going to see this more and more. The same thing with controls. Does everybody know what a historical rec is? Who knows what a historical rec is? Right, a few people, fewer people. And it gets to be a little trickier. Historical rec means that you had a release above unrestricted use and it was remediated to below unrestricted use. So if I have a release that's above commercial, it's remediated to below commercial, it's not an HREC. It has to be remediated to below unrestricted use. So it becomes a control if there's no exposure on the site. And you're doing it in accordance with state requirements as well. So when we look at identifying sources of PFAS contamination within the due diligence process, we're looking at what are the representative resources that we can use that are commonly available. And this is where the trick is. When we look at the science of what was presented here by Olivia, Natalia, and I love Tanya's because that actually was closer to the CRE market issues. But we need the data that we don't have that they talked about. We need that very badly because that determines what happens after you look at all these sources. And what's used typically in a pre-site reconnaissance review, and that's before you do the site visit and before you analyze the data, you're looking at, do I have red flag industries? Those industries that commonly produced or did possibly produce PFAS that could impact the subject property. They're looking at the industrial classification for typical PFAS industries. I'm doing a records review. Fortunately, the data record providers, which include EDR and Emeritus, are now considering the likelihood of PFAS at a property because they're taking a look at NAAQS codes, PFAS red flags, available data that's been submitted to the state in research studies or through transactional elements, and they're combining that into the records review to where you now have 11 different PFAS categories to look at. Everything from TSCA to just studies where the contamination was identified as a state site, Superfund MPL site. So they blended all those categories together. And then it also involves a review of government records, historical sources, and supplemental PFAS information. When we look at the red flag industries, there's a number of those. What we have new to the market in terms of the red flag industries, and this is the NAAQS codes, when we have new to the industry, which is going to be surprising and hit the commercial real estate market, and now I realize why I'm the lead into the legal panel that comes up, is we're going to have, for example now, we have car washes that were never an environmental concern. When we go to a property, do we now have to ask, does your fire suppression system have PFAS in it? Is it a FFF? So what do I have going on here that I didn't have before? I now have to ask, have you had a fire? How close are you to the airport? Have you had any incidents of fires across the street or on adjoining properties? So I have to consider all those factors now. And when we look at what's provided by a regulatory database, it can be very, very helpful. In this case, I've got a dry cleaner site, I've got a firefighting training site near the property, and I have a DOD defense site that's up gradient. Now, my database for PFAS typically only looks a half a mile. And what we saw through the presentations here, that's not far enough. And it all depends on the pathway. Am I looking at a surface water pathway that can impact the property that I'm looking at? Or am I looking at a groundwater pathway? And these are the different categories that they have for PFAS. And you can see Tosca in there in PFAS industries. And the total number of sites that are identified as PFAS industries, in this case, I've got 80 on this map. Holy smokes, I've got 80. How do I deal with that? And I've got anthropogenic impacts all around me. I don't know what the sources are. I can't afford, if I was purchasing the property, and let's say I'm going for an SBA deal, how can I afford to have the research done to determine whether my property was a source as now a laundromat because of the fabrics going into it that now contain waterproof substances that are filtered through the system? I wasn't concerned with PERC, but now I've got to be concerned with the waterproof substances that were processed through my laundromat. And the records review and the regulatory database, we're looking at basically the ECHO records for fire training sites that really are of the greatest impact where it's obvious sources. But that's nice to have those obvious sources. And we're also looking at airport data. That's great. We're looking at Department of Defense sites. That's great that that's being done. But on a local level, the reality of it is when you're in a residential area and you're in a suburban area and you're looking at trying to figure out what the issues are with your site and the surrounding property with relevant to PFAS, I've got only limited sources, but I got to look at them closely. In this case, we look at fire insurance maps, historic fire insurance maps that can sometimes go back, in this case, 1903, and aerial photographs. And we have to mesh that together to determine what was the potential lifetime or duration of operations of that source. And as we look here, oh my gosh, what do I have? I have plastics manufacturing in a 1962 fire insurance map as a subject property that I'm looking at. How long was it there? My previous fire insurance map from 1950 didn't show it. But at least I look at that aerial photograph, which are sometimes blurred. You're looking at the reality of what consultants have to go through. And I'm seeing the same building. There's a likelihood that that was there in 1955 as well. And I do the same thing to combine the information to determine the duration of operations after. Now, we also use city directories, and those can be very helpful. And in this case, for the same site, I realized at 123 Gertrude Street, from 1992 to 2005, it was dumpy plastics. And then they had another tenant that was called Spilling Electronics Chemicals. Well, in this case, just Spilling Electronics. It's probably his last name. In 2017, I had dumpy plastics in a PFAS gallery. What? Oh my goodness. Terrible, just terrible. Then I have government file reviews. Folks, how long is the retention period where I can actually draw on previous contamination issues? If my site goes back that long and there was investigations conducted after CERCLA in the 80s, I may not have that information there provided by the state based on the retention periods. The disconnect is retention periods do not equal clean site. So when it comes to contamination that can be persistent like PFAS, retention periods are critical. We shouldn't have retention periods for environmental matters within government records unless that site is determined to be clean but because of the dynamics of our industry, just shouldn't get rid of those records. So we have a disconnect there, and I'll get into that a little bit more, but we also have other sources to look at now. The Environmental Work Group has a great resource where they provide identification of airports, landfills, sewage and waste treatment plants, military sites. They feel that greater than 700 will ultimately be an issue. Confirmed PFAS contamination sites, over 5,000. They have an assumed amount, based on the data they've collected so far, that suspected industrial discharges that have not been investigated will amount to over 40,000. That is startling. If we divided it by the number of states, and considering that a lot of them are in rural, not in rural areas unless you're dealing with biosolids, but you're dealing with the industrial portions, with that numbers, it's almost overwhelming. And when we look at this, even, and I've got, where are we? We're right here? Oh my goodness, look what we got here. Are we impacted? Well, a little bit to the north of us and very close is a PFAS site. Now, my client comes to me and says, hey, you know, I was wondering if you could look at this property. It's vacant. I'd like you to do a phase 1. Okay, no problem. Do you know what the history is? No, I don't. But we love it. It's in a great commercial area. And we go ahead and we do those historical looks and those reviews and the research. And what do we discover? Metal plating facility. For all we know, it could have been the plastics manufacturing as well, or waterproofing location for products. So it's really hard to tell until you do that research. We haven't even gotten to PFAS yet, really. We haven't really looked at how is our site relevant to the PFAS industry and its impact on our subject property. So we also then do the site reconnaissance. You take many photographs, you conduct interviews. Now my interview questions, am I now asking, what kind of fire suppression system do you have? Do you know what chemical was in your fire suppression system? Did you have a fire? Did your adjoining properties close by you have a fire? And what was the potential impact from that? And previous documentation, did you do previous due diligence? What are the violations? Did the violations deal with handling processes where there could have been spills into various pathways? So it's a very dynamic process. And when we get into that and we start looking at pathways, soil vapor, groundwater, surface water discharge, we're really looking at the extent and dynamics of a particular property either receiving contamination pathway confluence to affect public health, or you're actually looking at how that property could have impacted other properties. So when you're looking at a phase 2, you're actually looking at that extent and that nature. And the other issue that we have as it rises to that level is we don't have EPA levels for cleanup and soil. And we have them only for a few PFAS and water, groundwater, for drinking. And only 2 of those are hazardous substances. So when we look at the future and what we have to analyze, it becomes almost overwhelming in the due diligence world. What's going to result? There's going to be many more discoveries. What are the reopeners? The reopeners are, well, I know that there's PFAS there. I know that there's PFOA there. What do we do when we look at the other PFAS in the real estate industry according to the definitions that ASTM has? We're looking at those as what we call BERs, business environmental risks. They are not a hazardous substance, but they could be in the future. Is that going to be a reopener? If my level of 4 parts per trillion that I'm analyzing for PFOA and PFAS in groundwater is not detected, and I close the site at 4 parts per trillion, and the average detection limit now is improved customarily to 1 with a goal of 0, is that a reopener? And a lot of that can be resolved by state movement and how they look at liability and public health. And we're kind of running out of time here, so the other slides I'll leave to you for informational purposes. But we need to look at this in a broader sense. We take a look at this from a practical sense on what can impact a property, and we have to look at this possibly in an innovative fashion. I don't have the solution, but if we look at states like Michigan, if you are purchasing contaminated property and you're not liable for it, you only have to investigate on the subject property. You don't have to delineate off the property. And then your next obligation when the transaction goes through that you have to submit to the state, or you can submit to the state, it's optional, is to have a due care plan prepared. You have to prepare it. It's optional to submit it to the state, and that's how you're going to prevent unacceptable exposure for the site use and the site occupants on that property. The data that you use to put together the initial baseline assessment, which includes the phase 1, is submitted to the state, has to be submitted to the state. So the state now, because they have these transactions going on and they're keeping the market moving, is now getting more data submitted to them, and they have a broader perspective of the contamination, and they now can then rank that contamination, look at what potential sources are in terms of liability, and move from that direction. And that handles and takes care of any potential changes in the dynamics of the regulations with PFAS, as long as you don't have vapor intrusion and you've got a soil management plan. You're not going to use groundwater. Those will be your controls. Michigan is the only state I know that has that process laid out like that, even though there are other states that provide liability protections. Ohio's moved out of the VAP program for new acquisitions. They have it. Utah has it. Tennessee has it, and there's other states moving in that direction. But when we look at states that have strict liability, we've got some problems, particularly when we're dealing with SBA deals that are maybe what? We're looking at $500,000, $1 million, and the liability could be on the owner that's buying that property. So I wanted to bring all of this together so that we have a reach into the reality of what can impact the commercial real estate market. And a note that I want to make is when we look at how states look at closing sites, particularly if we're looking at PFAS, and we look at no further action letters, the disconnect between the definitions is extreme. I've seen a closure letter that didn't have any data in it. It says as long as the property is commercial, with the levels that are above criteria in place at the property and the location where they're at, this site can be closed. So I look at that and I go, well, what was the data? Do I have levels that are above unrestricted use? What's the control that didn't have to be filed? It's not required sometimes where you have to file a reuse restriction. So this is the enigma and the issues that are really brought on by states in the disconnect with ASTM due diligence standards. So I know my talk was titled Navigating, but it's more like, how do I find my way through the forest when I have no map? And that's really my point. So I'll skip through this on the phase 2s. I think we had some coverage on that with other talks. And to sum it up, I know that you were looking for gobbledygook, and I gave you mumbo jumbo, but that's the reality of where we're at in the due diligence world. So I want to thank you, and I really appreciate being here.
Thank you, Stephen. Are there any questions or comments? Got one over here. Steve, back up.
Thank you. So I agree with you in the process, additional questions pertaining to fires and things like that will be needed. But you talk about, the standard definition of a wreck. In my mind, the due diligence process through ASTM for a phase 1 doesn't change, right? Just because these are potentially going to be hazardous substances.
Right.
Would you agree?
Right.
I mean, you bring up the example of the plastic company. Likely you would be looking at that anyways for other hazardous substances.
Yes, yeah. Fortunately, when we're looking at, for example, a manufacturing facility that's had a long duration that used PFAS, we're also looking at other hazardous substances. And we're looking at the extent of those. The trick is, with PFAS, is that as a forever chemical, as these other elements, whether they be PERC, degrading into TCE, DCE, vinyl chloride, we could see that breakdown occurring, but with PFAS we don't. And what happens is it can travel farther, it can be in more media, and it becomes a real hard thing to track. And those triggers for the other releases resulted in a no further action letter. Now, was that really something that should be opened up? Should we really look at what the extent is? So when we look at something as being original CREC, is there really no exposure? And it all depends on the pathways. If they're using groundwater, that could be a real issue.
It really comes up with
Question here.
agricultural land.
Yeah, and agricultural land, I hate, oh my gosh, Tanya, you did a great job with that. These farmers are really in tough shape right now. And it's really sad what's happening with the farming community. So, but yeah, when we talk about biosolids, that's going to be a real problem.
Can you tell me where in the ASTM E152721 standard it references the commercial and the residential standards and the no action levels that you referred to in your talk?
In 1527, it's actually, you can look within the definitional portion of the standard where it actually says CREC on it. It's copyrighted, but it only costs about $75 a year to get a copy. So I couldn't put the quote on there because it's copyrighted. But it's really something that has been up for discussion during the renewal and during the 21 discussions. And part of the issue with the BER is just to get into some of the terminology issues that we face. With the BER, it's actually identified as non-ASTM, which would be radon, asbestos, lead, and so forth. But within the definition of BER, it says that it can be other ASTM considerations not included and it's like not included as a REC, CREC, or HREC. Well, what the heck is it if it's not a CREC, HREC, REC, and no REC? What is it if it's an ASTM consideration? I'll tell you what it is. It's those chemicals that could be classified as hazardous substances. It could be that brand new underground storage tank where if it had a release, it would cause a lot of destruction to the environment, but it likely won't in the near future. It's not imminent. That's a BER. So when we talk about anywhere from 15,000 to 1.6 million chemicals that can be classified as hazardous, potentially, a good portion of that, we've got a large fraction of BERs right now. So I don't know if I answered your question. I hope I did.
They list them as chemicals of concern in the standard.
Oh, the chemicals of concern in the standard are items identified by CERCLA as hazardous substances under CERCLA Doesn't necessarily match RCRA, it eventually does when they go into RCRA. And petroleum products. Okay.
Good deal. Yep. Thanks. Thank you, Stephen. I want to put in a pitch for the regulatory and legal panel that's going to start at 10:30. We've come to the end of our session here. It's 10 o'clock. Looking forward to seeing the rest of you later on this afternoon, or I mean later on this morning. And thanks for coming.